breaking bread together and forming deep relationships are the kinds of practices that can respond to the thorny, intractable issues that come with someone struggling with substance use issues.
Welcome to Intrinsically Motivated, where we're having conversations with experts in the field of addiction, recovery, and those who've been affected by it as we seek to mobilize the church to replace addiction and mental health challenges with flourishing. Episode 3 features Dr. Brett McCarty, an assistant research professor of theological ethics, associate director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative, and an assistant professor in population health sciences at the Duke School of Medicine. I'm Tanner Clements, and I'm the Media and Training Director for Uplift Appalachia.
I just want to start very high level because part of what we're wanting to do with this podcast is I'm just trying to learn all the different intersections between theology and science and research and how all of these kind of come together amidst the opioid epidemic, which is one of the things that obviously you're really heavily focused on, but just kind of what is the field of theological ethics really? That's not a phrase that I think a lot of people will say. I love theological ethics, but what does that mean?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And first, thanks so much for having me, Tanner. It's a joy to be in conversation and to have been walking together for many years now. So thank you. And theological ethics is really just a mode of reflecting on what it means to try to act faithfully as Christians. And it's a relatively new field. Christian ethics was a field kind of invented in the 20th century as an academic field. It would have fallen under moral theology and just theology more proper a long time ago. But really trying to reflect on how to understand our contemporary context and our lives within it and the actions we may be taking and the trajectories we may be on in light of what Christian scripture and tradition have taught us about who the Lord is and who we are to be in relation to the Lord. So that's a way of understanding theological ethics that is pretty broad, but it is an academic field that's trying to reflect in a more systematic way on something that people do in Christian churches every week, which is try to reckon with what it means to faithfully follow Jesus.
So it's kind of the academic version of figuring out what it means to be a believer.
Yeah.
In a sense.
With an eye toward questions around moral action, less of like there's liturgical theology that might be focused on worship or biblical theology and biblical studies that are more scripturally focused. But we Christian ethicists are amateurs in all those fields. We dabble with everything. So
okay. So how long have you known that was what you wanted to pursue? When did you find theological ethics?
So when my wife and I got married in 2009, I was finished up my first year in divinity school. We would sit down at the dinner table, and so Dana is a pediatric physical therapist, was working in the NICU at Duke at the time. She's now teaching on faculty at UNC. And, I'd say, well, today I was reading this amazing stuff from Augustine or Calvin or whoever, and I'd kind of go off all this abstract stuff, and she'd say, well, today I saw a baby die. And that was real. And she was trying to grapple with what does it mean to attend to these infants, many of whom are suffering and dying for no good reason at all. And how to understand that as a Christian, where is the Lord in this space when babies are dying and parents love them dearly and are grieving so deeply. And I realized that what she had to talk about was maybe a little bit more important than what I want to talk about, as much as I love reading theologians and talking about their ideas. And I also realized that our churches that we have been raised in and that we're walking in now had not really done a great job of supporting Dana and folks like her in this work of attending to suffering and attending to people whose bodies are struggling and they're trying to walk alongside them. And there's this long history of Christians not only attending faithfully to people who are ill and sick, but really being innovators in the space of healthcare and what does it mean to care for folks. But that long history seemed to be kind of forgotten when modern Christians in America were stepping into the hospital to practice. And so it was kind of thinking at those intersections from that dinner table conversation to what does it mean to try to really equip practitioners in the healthcare realm and pastors and clergy and faith leaders in the church to really understand, to try to understand more faithfully and deeply what it means for our whole selves, including our bodies, to belong to the Lord, and for us to care for one another as members of the body of Christ as Christ has cared for us, and the deep commitments to one another and to our embodied existence that implies, all within this context of the strange world of medicine that we often find ourselves in.
So when you came into that, was the opioid crisis in the back of your mind when you started heading into that, or was that something you kind of found along the way and just kind of grabbed onto as a specific focus? Or
there are a lot of ways I could answer that, because a lot of different contingencies came together for me to be doing this work right now. So when you were reading my jargony bio and the questions of faithful action in the modern hospital, that's my dissertation, the first project that I was describing that flowed from that dinner table conversation. If you fast forward a couple of years, I'm finishing up my dissertation, several years from that moment. So say 2016, 2017, trying to search for a second project and preparing to apply for postdocs. I had an extended family member who overdosed on opiates, and they're still alive. But I was sitting in the ICU thinking about in the waiting room of the ICU while Dana was visiting with this person. And I was thinking about all the things in this person's life that had led to this moment, and all the thorny issues from, loss of jobs to multiple prescriptions for opiates to toxic relationships to estrangement from family and the church, like all the wicked problems that many of the wicked problems that mark the opioid crisis were present in really thorny ways that I like to fix. I'm a thinker around fixing things, and there's no quick fix at that moment. But it seemed really important. And again, it felt like the church had a lot that Christians could be saying and doing and responding, but we're failing to overall. And so it was that moment in the context of me searching for a second project that really pulled me into this work. And some of the contingencies that I was alluding to involve also getting connected with folks in Southern Appalachia and really learning to love walking with the amazing folks around here and learning from their work and witness.
Which is really how our paths crossed, because obviously we have that same kind of focus of we want to inspire the church, figure out how to motivate the church, train the church to be involved in all these ways that we agree that the church ought to be involved in these sorts of things. Kind of move people from struggling with addiction toward flourishing, all of that. So you've been trying to understand recently just how the church is doing a good job of that, where the church is failing, where the communication issues and stuff have come through. Tell me a little bit about kind of what that has looked like practically for you.
Yeah, so through a research project in my postdoctoral fellowship, and then another grant-funded project as I came on faculty at Duke in 2019, I've been interviewing folks, 24 folks in that first project, 36 in the second, and doing analysis of those transcripts and spending time in the region and walking with folks alongside those more formal interviews. And that's the kind of context of listening and learning that I try to speak from when I talk about what I've seen. And I'd say that the thing that really stands out to me is that the practices that churches have of sharing testimonies with one another, breaking bread together, and forming deep relationships are exactly the kinds of practices that can respond to the thorny, intractable issues that come with someone struggling with substance use issues. So that context of sharing stories, sharing life together, walking with one another is exactly the right kind of setting for the right kinds of responses. That doesn't solve anything, but it does set you up well.
So when you first started, so obviously you're sitting down talking to people. Some of these people you may have met before you start interviewing, but sometimes you're sitting down just to talk to somebody for the first time. So the first time you start to sit down to talk to people, knowing what it is that you're trying to talk about, what was that like for you to kind of get into that space and really be like, because you're talking about things where sometimes people are going to have to be very vulnerable if they're going to be really honest with you, that sort of thing. What was it like kind of stepping into that space at the beginning when you first started having these conversations with people?
Yeah, I'd say from that first moment to the present, it's just a really incredible, humbling moment and privilege to sit with someone and hear their story and for them to open up in those ways. That I don't take that lightly, and it's a pretty sacred space when someone is willing to share out of spaces of vulnerability and wondering and hurt, and I'm really grateful for that. I love stories and storytelling. I can go on far too long, my wife says, with these things, but this is a region that is famous for storytelling, right? Like one of the first things I did was go to the International Storytelling Festival, or International Storytelling Center and the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro. And I mean, you have these 5 massive tents set up with people telling stories, and they're amazing. And so just hearing those stories, whether it's underneath the big tent or sitting alongside someone and talking with them, it's an honor and it's a joy. Now, I have a mentor in qualitative research who rightly says that my transcripts are at the far edge of what's acceptable in terms of wandering around a topic to actually cover the domains of an interview. And I do cover them, or at least I try to, she said. But I'm a 7, as you said, so I'm following the interesting trails.
We want to find all the interesting little details and come up with all the big fun ideas. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you this question twice, but in focusing on it 2 different ways. Yeah. So the question is, what did you learn from the research side? Like, I mean, I know you've obviously been kind of starting to share some of the results of some of these things that you've been telling. What kinds of things have you been learning about the effectiveness or the limitations or the ways that the church is good? I mean, you've kind of started to allude to some of that. The ways that churches are effective at helping people who are struggling, but also what are some of the limitations that you've seen? What are from both directions? What are the things that we need to kind of recognize about ourselves in the church that we could be doing better, or things that we need to just trust? These are good. You should pursue this more. Keep going with that.
Yeah. So I should have mentioned at the beginning, at Duke, I'm jointly appointed in the Divinity School, as you said, and the School of Medicine's Department of Population Health Sciences, where I'm a qualitative researcher. And I'll kind of answer first with my kind of qualitative research meets public health, meets the role of religious communities hat on. Because some of what I've learned in the region, I think, really matters for the different fields and practitioners and discourses that relate to that work, including the church. So with that hat on, I'd say that some of the things I learned are things that people know deeply on the ground. I learned it from them. And one would be that stigma's a really big problem. That's not a new thing to learn, but some of the facets that might be new that I learned about it are ways that there can be stigma against spiritual responses to substance use issues by more kind of secular approaches, whether it's medical or the criminal justice system or somewhere else. But there also can be stigma from religious folks towards those more secular modes of responding. And so we normally talk about stigma in terms of like kind of judgment and shame and ostracizing of people who are struggling with substance use issues. And that's very real and deeply hurtful and damaging to so many. And the church has been a context where a lot of that's happened, a lot of silence and shame and things kind of repressed in the shadows and people turned away. But then even when you begin to try to bring things out into the open and so, quote unquote, destigmatize them, you find these other kind of layers to the onions of stigma that you have folks not really trusting the responses of others and really kind of turning folks away from them as well, rather than trying to find the kind of common ground and common good and overlap that might be possible when you bring things together. So that's one thing I learned. Another is that communication is really hard and really important. There are a lot of people doing a lot of different things, and we need to juggle all of that in some coherent fashion towards the flourishing of folks who are struggling with substance use issues. And that requires constant communication between the different, both for individuals and their relational networks trying to navigate these systems, and also for organizations and the organizational networks in ecology that are trying to bring together more holistic, deep responses to the issues at hand.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we run into. Because like we find so many people like we're wanting to see the same kinds of things happen, but it's so easy to just get really pigeonholed into focusing on we're trying to do this. That's so right. Obviously no one else is, but then it's like, no, everyone else still wants to see.
That's right.
They might have their own kind of context to it, but.
And, everybody has the way they see an issue and the way the history they're approaching it. There are different funding mechanisms that structure how folks come toward things. So to step outside of that is this, in some ways, rub against the grain of the kind of institutional pathways that folks are inside of. And this is, again, where the practices of relationship building, of sharing stories with one another can really be helpful in bridging the gaps and not letting your silos blind you to these possible connections. And I'd say the third big area that, with my kind of qualitative research or public health hat on, that we've learned is that there really, and this flows from what I've just said, that there really needs to be more trust developed between different responses to substance use issues, especially religious and medical responses. That a lot of distrust marks those communities, and it might be earned in different ways in different sides, that distrust, that mistrust. But both sides have reasons to want to collaborate with the other. For medical folks, they realize these social determinants of health really matter, and they need to be engaging with community partners. And there's this whole realm of talking about that, and religious communities are a key part there. And then for religious folks, the faith commitments say that the Lord believes that their embodied existence is good, and that caring for their bodies is a good thing. And so seeking medical care as part of that care is not intrinsically bad or disordered. That's part of it can be part of what it means to be a faithful disciple in caring for your body. So there are reasons that each community has to want to partner with each other, but there's a lot of mistrust. And so again, this is where testimony, breaking bread, forming relationships can be central sites of overcoming these differences.
Have you seen any places where that's working really well already? I don't know how specific you can be about people you've talked with, but have you seen some little pockets of community, even if you're not being super specific, where you're seeing that it has worked out that way and it's not just a limiting factor?
Yeah. Yes, I have. The one story that comes to mind is if someone is kind of in the thralls of their substance use issues and really needs the space to work on their lives, that they might turn to MAT, medication-assisted treatment, to give them the space to do that work on themselves. And it's in the context of their church community that they are able to do that work on themselves. So the medical treatment frees up some of their kind of almost like bodily bandwidth in a way, or their mental and emotional bandwidth to have the ability to develop new habits and patterns and to work toward a new form of life that they yearn for. And the church community provides a context within which those habits can be formed and those new relationships be formed, that new trajectory and form of life really be offered. And so I've heard several stories of folks when they feel like they're in a better place, titrating down and like tapering off their Suboxone treatments over time in consultation with their medical practitioners, but as part of this community that's giving them life. And that to me seems like everybody wins in that scenario, but it requires an ability to see how others and their approaches can fit inside of your vision of what flourishing the good life might look like for this person.
Yeah, so it's like a perfect kind of picture of everybody kind of coming together to work toward that flourishing. That's we want more stories like that that we can start to share, that sort of thing. All right, so I'm going to ask you the same question again. Mm-hmm. What have you learned? But this time a little bit more introspective. So what have you learned about you, or how have you been affected or changed while you've been having all these conversations and kind of putting yourself in this community in this way? What are some things that maybe have changed in you, or you've grown, or areas that you've really seen yourself be affected? Yeah,
well, we didn't plan any of this, but this actually pairs up nicely with my second mode of responding to your question, which now I'll get to, which is to speak less with my qualitative public health researcher hat on and more with my kind of normative Christian ethics, theological ethics hat on. So one of my first experiences of church-based responses to substance use issues, my first experience was in the basement of a church where a recovery ministry was happening. And I went and worshiped with them and tried to learn what was going on and developed a lot of relationships out of that setting that I still am grateful to have to this day. There's a whole interesting kind of, not just academic, but important story to be had about the history of the 12-step model, its kind of pious evangelical roots, the kind of stripping away of overt theological language and the way it's been reincorporated into worship through these recovery ministries. But there's still this kind of individualistic, privatizing focus. I mean, that's a really interesting story, an important one. But that's not what you asked. That's not what I really should talk about, which is that there in that room, I saw people worshiping and proclaiming their need for the Lord in a way that I was in awe of, that they clearly knew in their bones, much more deeply than I, that they could not get their lives right on their own, that they needed desperately the Lord and the Lord's people to help them. And that is true of me. It's a profession that any Christian makes on some level. And in worshiping there in that church basement and continuing to worship and walk with folks struggling with substance use issues, I've learned more deeply what it means to be a Christian myself. And that sounds almost too easy, because what that recovery ministry there in the church basement has to offer is a space to find and follow Jesus as our lives are claimed in walking with folks struggling with substance use issues, that reorients my life away from the vision of success that an elite research university offers me and a pretty wealthy white congregation offers me, toward a mode of excellence marked by finding and following Jesus among the least of these, those folks on the margins of society that are pushed out in so many ways and looked down upon. And the social pressures that make possible my life's success are in some way also pressing these folks to the margins of society in the kind of opposite direction. And for myself, I found this to be a space where my own sense of what the good life is and a life of discipleship that reorients, or at least I'm trying to let it reorient the way I think about excellence and success in my own life.
And I think that's a really helpful word, especially for those of us that are wanting to help in some way. It's really easy to be like, I have all these answers. I'm coming in as the white knight here to save you. And it's so easy in whatever context you may become, whether it's an organization or, like you said, a really wealthy church or whatever it may be, to think we have the perfect solution. We're here to save, but to also realize we have to come into this humbly too, needing salvation just like everyone else. You know, we can find a much more humble kind of common ground place to kind of, like you said, sit down and just really worship alongside people. And I think that's a really helpful place for us to try to get as a church society, as a church collective, you know, to not just come into it, or even in the nonprofit world, you know, like we said, we all have these, I think we have a really great thing to offer, but to say, I'm coming in, I'm your salvation, completely undermines the whole message of the gospel. We shouldn't come in trying to replace the gospel, instead of trying to support it through whatever means. And I think that's really super helpful. Very cool.
And I think that this is where there's a kind of process of discovery of what a path towards flourishing might look like, both for someone struggling with substance use issues and for yourself and walking with them. I think about the Road to Emmaus passage in Luke 24, where these two disciples are walking on this dusty road, talking about how Jesus was crucified, this guy they thought was Israel's Messiah, and everything they had devoted their lives to suddenly felt upturned, and they were really in a space of kind of trauma and shock. And this third companion starts walking with them and talking with them, asks them what they're talking about, and he takes time to listen as they share their story and things unfold. And then in the process of their sharing the stories, this third companion, who is Jesus, redescribes what they've seen through the story of Scripture in a way that reorients their lives, but they still don't fully get it. And it's only until Jesus breaks bread with them that they recognize that he is Jesus. And so there's something there about walking with folks, trying to reinterpret our lives in the light of Scripture, and breaking bread with one another, that in that context we meet Jesus and we learn what it means to orient our lives towards following him in a way that takes time. Like, that is a road of some length that you have to walk on. And it's in that walking together that we can discover the right path forward. There's no, like you were saying, like no one-size-fits-all process that you can offer in the abstract.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love that. So you're wrapping up kind of this first phase of your research. Now what are you doing? What's next?
Yeah. So lots of wrapping up to do in terms of getting publications out of this work. As a 7, I love to chase after the ideas, but grinding through the publication process is not my strongest suit. My work in this region in Southern Appalachia made possible a second grant, or I guess a third grant, that for what's called the Churches Promoting Recovery project, churchespromotingrecovery.org, which is a set of practical resources that we've tried to develop for faith leaders who are seeking to better respond to substance use issues in their context. And so we're about to post those up on the web, and ETSU's own Dr. Andy Clements has an interview there, and we hope that those resources will be really useful. I'd love to get further funding to study congregations and faith leaders who engage with those resources and what impact they might have. So searching for funding is one thing. But in terms of what's next, I honestly would hope to take the time to not just work on getting the articles out, which need to get done soon, but really take the time to work on a book coming out of this time. So take another year or two to walk with folks here in the process of writing a book about what I've seen and learned, to try to tell their stories and what's going on in a way that the kind of world of Christian ethics, which is a world defined by kind of academic books, could hear and recognize.
Very cool. So what motivates you to keep obviously chasing that next big idea is one of those things that we're really naturally going to follow. Yeah. But what is it that's keeping you going in continuing to pursue this?
Last night we had an event sharing some of these research results with folks, and heard the story of someone who has been struggling with substance use issues for quite some time, and the repercussions of those substance use issues, which is, time in jail, loss of various privileges as a citizen. And this person had just gotten their license and had been working for several weeks now after coming out of a lengthy jail sentence. And to hear this person's story and to think about all the people who've made possible that moment, that's a story that I really believe a lot of people need to know. And there are a lot of stories like that. If I earlier I said we really need to testify and tell stories to one another. For me as a researcher, I hope to try to lift up the stories that I've perceived and heard and received and tell them in ways that other audiences can hear and receive and be maybe potentially even transformed by. So it's hearing that story last night and knowing that story needs to be trumpeted from the rooftop, so to speak, from these different worlds. That really excites me and gets me going.
Yeah, the more of those we get, I think, the more momentum we can get behind this movement to kind of get the church to really step in and fill these gaps where they can and should. Yeah. I think that's really important. So anything else that you want to share about anything going on in your life that you think is really exciting that you just want people to know about?
Well, the kind of third hat that I wear in terms of work that you mentioned briefly, I'm the Associate Director of the Theology, Medicine, Culture Initiative. And I want to make a plug for some of our programs because...
Do it.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for. You're just here for the shameless plugs.
Right, exactly. We have a residential fellowship where folks with vocations to healthcare come for a year or two of theological study and formation. And to walk with those students and alumni, we've had 7 cohorts come through, over 70 students who are, in residency or fellowship or attendings or NPs or PAs. I mean, they're amazing people scattered around the country. It is such a joy to walk with them during the year. And we have a new program that's a hybrid certificate in theology and healthcare that is for established practitioners who can't uproot their lives and move to Durham, but instead come for 2 weeks during the year and a lot of online work. And we just had our first cohort come through of that, and just amazing people from around the country really finding deep friendship and solidarity with one another. People who often felt like they were kind of alone as Christians trying to really live out their faith in their work, realizing that they're not alone, that there are a lot of friendships they can have. So creating worlds where those kinds of friendships can form and getting to walk alongside those folks as their lives are transformed and continue to hear and learn from them. Man, that is so fun.
That's continuing to bring the science and the church and all of it, all these different people together so they can have more of those conversations that you're saying we need to have.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And they happen in telling stories and breaking bread and forming relationships with one another.
Yeah. So where, if people are wanting to find out more about that, what's the best place for them to do that?
Oh, yeah. So that would be at our website, tmc.divinity.duke.edu. It's the Theology, Medicine, Culture Initiative, and we've got a residential fellowship and a hybrid certificate in theology and healthcare. Would love and welcome applications from folks.
And your new church network website?
churchespromotingrecovery.org. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been fun. I'm sure we will come up with 12 more questions that we should have talked about after
Yes.
this, and we'll have
Yes.
to do a part 2 sometime.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Next time on Intrinsically Motivated.
When people feel genuinely welcome for who they are, that they are seen as beloved, lovable, they can be a part of that everyday kind of interaction and can be part of that church is really important.
Intrinsically Motivated is an Uplift Appalachia podcast. Uplift Appalachia seeks to replace addiction and mental health challenges with flourishing, and we believe that an intrinsically motivated church is the answer. To learn more, visit upliftappalachia.org.